Hi guys, welcome back to Climate of the Common Era. The second of 3 oral sessions. And Ed Cook is up here to assist me, and Jason Smearden and Kevin Enchikaitis are the co-conveners here. And we have a technological experiment to try out on you, which is our invited speaker, Natalie Kehrwald, could not make it, but she sent us her slides and narrated over them for us, and we're going to deliver that to you in a first for me at AGU. So hopefully this is going to go well, and here's Natalie Kehrwald.
We'll pretend that she's here and set the timer going.
In the past decade, we have witnessed massive wildfires, which have resulted in billions of dollars of damages, have forced hundreds of thousands of people to evacuate their homes, and have resulted in the destruction of many communities. These fires were set unintentionally sometimes by people, and obviously have impacted many human lives. In addition, during the last decade, we have witnessed how fires can influence the climate. For example, fires in Indonesia in the summer of 2015 emitted more carbon dioxide than was emitted during the same time period by the net fossil fuel burning across the entire United States. Here we examine the interactions between fires, climates, and humans through the Common Era by looking at both sediment cores and ice cores. We developed a method for examining levoglukosone in both sediment and ice cores. Levoglukosone is a specific molecular marker that can only be produced by biomass burning at temperatures around 250 degrees Celsius. Levoglukosone has 2 isomers, monazone and galactosone, where the ratios between these isomers can give you a general idea of what has burned in the past, if it has been, for example, grasslands versus hardwoods. Due to this specificity of levoglukosone, when you're able to quantify it in paleo records, you know that this can only have been produced by biomass burning, and therefore you have a very specific record of past fire activity. I'm going to show you 2 examples of our work, one from New Zealand and one from the Neem ice core in northern Greenland. New Zealand is one of the most extreme examples of being able to look at a location before and after the arrival of humans and their impact on the resulting fire activity. This slide is the work of Dave McWethy and colleagues published in 2010, where they examined charcoal records in a series of lake cores across the South Island of New Zealand. You can see this compilation of all of them together in the plot on the bottom right of the slide, where before the arrival of the Maori, you essentially had very little to none natural fire, and then after the arrival of the Maori, you can see a step increase in the amount of fire activity. For each individual plot, this light gray vertical line is showing you the timing of the arrival of the Maori and the initial overall burning period, and then you can see the changes in the peak burning by the charcoal depending on the locations. And we're going to look at 2 of these records in greater detail, which are highlighted in yellow, which are Lake Diamond and Lake Kirkpatrick. The more proxies that you're able to look at together, the more robust idea you can have of what has happened in the past. So we compare this existing charcoal records to our new levoglukosone records from these lakes. Charcoal is an excellent indicator of local fire activity, and levoglukosone tends to be a more regional record of fire activity. So levoglukosone is injected into smoke plumes, it's transported for thousands of miles, and then returns to the surface through both wet and dry deposition. So we examined charcoal versus levoglukosone in its isomers in records from New Zealand lakes in order to be able to see the correlations between them, which you can see in plots A and B. We also took our initial levoglukosone records method and changed it into a GCMS method in order to be able to incorporate the presence of humans. And so for looking at the presence of humans, we examine fecal sterols. And fecal sterols are essentially produced by human digestion, are then deposited, in this case, near the lakes, transported into the lakes, and then become associated with the lake sediments. So then when you look in the sediment core, you're able to look and find the fecal sterols. And in this case, in this analytical method, we look at both levoglukosone and the fecal sterols within the same run. The idea of looking at fecal sterols in this way we want to highlight is actually not our idea, it's the idea of other research groups. And here our idea is more combining the two together. These are the results from Lake Kirkpatrick, one of the highlighted lakes. And you can see that here on the bottom, time is going to the right, where present is to the right of the graph. And you can see this sharp peak in fire activity as recorded both by the charcoal, which is in black, levoglukosone and its isomers, which is the dark red, and we also examined total PAHs in order to have 3 separate ways of examining past fire activity. And all 3 of these show this sharp peak in increased fire occurring at 1350 AD, with essentially no natural fire activity before that, and then much lower fire activity after that peak. If we look at the presence of humans, you can see this huge peak in total fecal sterols that's occurring at the same time, which is shown in the green record, and each fecal sterol then that we examined to the right. When you have fecal sterols in such a case, showing that humans were in the region, you can't ascribe the actual ignition to the humans. You know that humans were in the location, you know that we had a major fire peak occurring at that same time, but there isn't a chemical record showing that humans ignited the fires. If we look at another location, so here's Lake Kirkpatrick that we had just looked at in greater detail on the top. And the bottom plot is Lake Diamond, which is another lake in the South Island of New Zealand. You can see that instead of that quite sharp peak that we see in Lake Kirkpatrick, you see a more smoothed, more of a century-long peak in fire activity in the charcoal, as well as a more smoothed, a longer time period, in this case about 75 years, of humans being in the area of Lake Diamond. But in both cases, you see a marked decrease in the fire activity and a marked decrease in the presence of humans after that initial burning and after that initial major presence of humans in the area. If we look at pollen records from this location, you can see that after 1350, which is the time of the major peak in human presence and in fire, that there's a major change in the vegetation types at this location. So before 1350, the vegetation is primarily tall trees, and after 1350, you have a combination of tall trees, grasses, and bracken, where this combination then continues into the present. We know of the history of the South Island that these types of vegetation changes had occurred over much of the South Island, where within the century after the arrival of the Maori, 40% of the South Island of New Zealand was deforested. People have often debated how small bands of humans, such as the initial Maori, how they could have deforested such a large area in such a relatively short amount of time. Our results show that essentially what we're seeing is a burn and bolt strategy, where people lived in an area for a short amount of time, approximately 50 years, burned large swaths of that area, and then moved on to another area where the same thing occurred. And so then small bands of humans were moving from one location to the other, staying for relatively short amounts of time, changing the vegetation, which then never went back to its initial state of primarily being tall trees. Here I'm going to show you our results from the Neem ice core, where we looked at levoglukosone for the past 15,000 years. The Neem ice core is surrounded by the largest land masses in the world. So you are able to pick up fire aerosols from all across northern North America, as well as across all of northern Eurasia. Here on the bottom left, I have plotted the relative strengths of each source region, so the possibility that aerosols from this location would then influence the Neem ice core. To the right, you can see the fire record of the Neem ice core over the past 15,000 years. So the top is just the black is the raw levoglucosan data, and below that is the smoothed levoglucosan data in order to show this major peak that's occurring in fire activity at 2,500 years before present. We compiled charcoal records from all of these source areas. So from the Global Charcoal Database, all records that were 45 degrees north or higher, and you can see this result, which is in the red. And you can see from these that there isn't a peak that's occurring at 2,500 years before present, is what we're seeing in the levoglucosan record. Below that, we've plotted changes in temperature that we know that's affecting northern Greenland during this time, and you see that there's not an increase in temperature at 2,500 years before present, where increases in temperature in general often influence fire activity by increasing fire activity. In purple, we see changes in insolation, where there isn't a major change in insolation that's occurring at that time period. In fact, you're actually decreasing. And then below that, in the orange, we have the results from the JS Box Spitfire model, which only looks at climate parameters that are affecting Neem and these source areas during that same time period. So these do not incorporate any human influence. And if you look at only the climate parameters during this time period, you see that there isn't an increase in area burnt, which is the result from the model, at 2,500 years before present. In addition, in the greenhouse gases, where if you were having major forest fires across this entire area, you would expect to see perhaps changes in the greenhouse gases during that time period, and you don't see changes in either methane or carbon dioxide. So what we're seeing, this levoglucosan flux at 2,500 years before present, can't be influenced by only climate parameters, and it's also something's happening that's not large enough to be able to affect greenhouse gases on a global scale. What we do know, however, is that there was major deforestation happening across much of Europe at this time period, which we can then look at through compilations of pollen records across much of Europe at this time. So what was happening was major deforestation for early agriculture occurring at 2,500 years before present, where this timing coincides with what we were able to see in the Neem ice core. So we argue that what we're picking up in the Neem ice core during that time period are actually fire activity that's coming from European deforestation for agriculture. And so you're picking up a regional fire signal, which is why you're not seeing it on larger scales. So in conclusion, what we are able to see is that sometimes past human impacts on fire activity are greater than or equal to modern human impacts, where we showed the examples from both Neem and from New Zealand lakes. And for this region, it's essential to investigate regional responses to fire. So you might have major increased fire activity in some areas, such as what was occurring in Northern Europe at 2,500 years before present, but yet in the rest of the source areas, you're not seeing major changes in fire activity. And finally, I would really like to send you towards Melissa Dunham's poster, who is investigating related work where she's looking at levoglucosan levels in Alaskan ice cores as a record of past wildfires. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your time at AGU.
All right, we have no time time for questions.
Do we have a holograph of Natalie?
I'm sure she would love to be here.
Yes.
Okay, so we have the next speaker. Is Scott Steinschneider. Whoa, wow. Inferring spatiotemporal variations and the risk of extreme precipitation in the western United States from tree ring chronologies.
All right, great. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Scott Steinschneider, I'm from Cornell University, and before I begin, I just want to acknowledge my co-authors, some or many of whom are in the room, Michelle Ho, Park Williams, Manu Lal, and Ed Cook right here. And so what I'm going to be presenting today, admittedly, at least initially, we thought was a silly idea, which is, can we use a network of tree ring chronologies, shown by those brown triangles across the western US, to reconstruct the occurrence of extreme precipitation events, or at least the probability or changes in probability of extreme precipitation events across the western US. And I say it's, initially we thought it might be a silly idea because obviously these chronologies of tree rings are recording the total amount of water over the growing season that's available to the trees, and there's no obvious reason why that would be linked in any way to extreme events. But at West, there's two features that make this approach a little bit more plausible. So number one, a lot of the water, at least in particular regions at West, gets delivered in the form of extreme events. And number two, when these extreme events come in, often they're being delivered by a particular type of storm, an atmospheric river, which is being shown by these trajectories of air parcels sort of originating from Hawaii and moving up towards the west coast. And the shape of these atmospheric rivers, when they hit the west coast and then sometimes puncture into the interior, might leave a particular spatial footprint in the tree ring network. And that might provide a bit more information for reconstructing the occurrence of extremes. So that's the basic premise of what we're going to show. For those who are a little bit less familiar with these atmospheric rivers, so they're a type of storm that often hits the west coast. Often they're showed in that top left plot, a satellite image of integrated water vapor in the atmosphere. And you can kind of see this filament originating from Hawaii, shooting out toward the west coast and hitting California, and it brings a lot of rain with it. And so this is an image I stole from NOAA that's really nice, kind of showing these atmospheric rivers bumping right up into the Sierra Nevada, or if they're farther north, into the Cascades, and you get orographic lift and a lot of rain. And so a lot of the trees, particularly in California, are going to record this signal. And importantly, I don't expect you to read all the little text here, but I will highlight a bit of it. At least in certain parts, almost 30 to 50% of the annual precipitation in some of these regions can be delivered by just a few of these atmospheric rivers. So these ARs are very, very important for water supply, but then also for flood risk and extreme event risk, because they're so extreme in nature. And while most of the water in these atmospheric rivers, they're going to hit either the Cascades or the Sierra Nevada and lose most of their moisture, particularly powerful ones can actually puncture through further into the continental interior of the western US. And so there's been these really awesome papers over the last couple of years. I've highlighted a few of them that have actually looked at reanalysis data and found sort of these preferential pathways for how atmospheric rivers puncture into the interior of the US. And so I took a figure from Alexander et al. 2015, which gives a typology or a schematic of how these ARs are puncturing in. You can find something similar in a paper by Rutgers et al. 2015. And what, again, these are showing are these pathways that ARs, they hit the west coast and they sort of puncture in. And when they do, in that bottom right cross-section of topography, they end up going farther into the interior in particular places, specifically where there are these relatively low elevation gaps in the Cascades or the Sierra Nevada. And that provides these conduits for the atmospheric rivers to move farther inland. And because the area between the Sierra Nevada and the Cascades and the Rockies is generally quite dry, the trees in that region are sort of hypersensitive to moisture, and they can really pick up some of this signal. So in the talk that I'm going to give here, I'm going to focus specifically on trying to look at extreme precip and these ARs in the southwest. So we're going to be looking at these type of storm tracks. I'm going to get into why we're going to look in the southwest in a second. But the first thing I want to do is I want to show one more motivating paper, and that is looking at, there's this paper 2014 by Rivera et al. What they did is they looked at this integrated water vapor transport. It's a metric often used to characterize atmospheric rivers. And they looked at ones that were hitting the Verde River Basin, and they did an EOF analysis of this. And they found that the two primary modes of this integrated water vapor transport, which explain 50% of the variability, you have the first mode on the left with a low over off the coast of California, delivering this atmospheric river from Hawaii all the way to the southwest coast. And on the right, the second mode, you have this more north-south transport of moisture sort of moving up into Mexico and southern Arizona and spreading out. So you want to hold this picture in your head because it's going to come back up in a second. So based on all that background, the motivating questions here, what are the primary space-time expressions of moisture being recorded by tree rings in the southwest? How does this relate to extreme precip and ARs in the southwest? Are these tree ring signatures uniquely related to extremes? Probably not. There's also probably some non-extreme precipitation relationship there. And can we use these tree ring signatures to try and reconstruct extreme precip and AR currents going backwards in time? So the methods that we're going to use, I'm going to use the Living Blended Drought Atlas. This is an update to the North American Drought Atlas developed by Ed. And so you can see all the chronologies on the map there that was used to create this gridded reconstruction of summertime PDSI. And the reason I'm going to focus on the southwest in this study can be shown here. If you take this reconstruction of summer PDSI from the tree rings and then correlate it to winter precip and summer precip on a grid cell by grid cell basis, in the bottom left you can see there's a really strong correlation between winter precip and this summertime reconstructed PDSI, the reason being the winter moisture gets delivered, stored as snowpack, melts off, fuels tree growth in the following summer, particularly in the southwest. That works really well. And in the southwest, there's no picking up of summertime precip from this product. So we've effectively separated out the wintertime signal. And the reason there's no summertime signal, even though there's a North American monsoon delivering lots of water during that time, the summer, it all evaporates off right away so the trees don't pick it up. So we can use this gridded product to really focus on winter precip and extremes in the southwest. Okay, so the methods for the study that I'm going to show here, very simple. We're going to take our gridded Living Blended Drought Atlas from 1451 to 2005, do an EOF analysis of it in the southwest, given by that red box there, and just relate the PCs to a few key features, geopotential height, the 500 level, integrated water vapor transport, again, something that characterizes atmospheric river activity, as well as extreme precip. And we're also going to relate these PCs to AR landfalls on the southwest coast. We got a cool data set to do that with. So I'm going to jump right into the results here. The top row, those are the primary spatial patterns of the LBDA in the southwest. And I'll note we defined the EOFs in that red box on the previous slide, but then just regressed our PCs against all the grid cells of the LBDA, which is why we have these patterns extending out of that box. And what you'll notice is the two primary patterns, the first EOF has this north-south gradient in the LBDA, sort of going from Mexico and centered in Arizona and New Mexico. And on the second EOF, there's more of a diagonal orientation on that top right plot, starting in Southern California and sort of puncturing inland. On the bottom row there, what we've done is taken the PCs of these first two EOFs and regressed them against geopotential heights, that's the shaded, as well as the integrated moisture flux, which are these arrows. And what you'll see is that first EOF, down below it, you'll see a low centered off of the southwest coast, and you'll see this south to north transport of moisture. This is very similar to that previous pattern that we saw, so I can pull that up now. That previous pattern from the 2014 paper looks a whole lot like sort of the signal we're seeing in this EOF with regard to integrated water vapor transport. And if you go to EOF 2, we have a low sort of related to our PC2 off of the California coast, and we have integrated water vapor transport coming from Hawaii and hitting the southwest. And again, that relates very well to what that Rivera et al. 2014 paper found. So essentially what this shows is that these two primary spatial patterns in the LBDA, in this tree ring reconstruction of moisture, are capturing the two primary patterns of atmospheric rivers being delivered to the southwest US. And this gives us some hope that we might be able to reconstruct some of the occurrence of extreme precipitation. And so I'm actually going to jump in and try and do that directly. So we can use our PCs from these first two EOFs of the LBDA in the Southwest and relate them to the number of extreme precipitation occurrences defined by precip over the 99.5th percentile. That's about 2 events per year. And also on the bottom row here, relating it to the mean magnitude of the exceedances over that threshold. So can our PCs explain the occurrences and the magnitudes of extreme precip? And if you look at the PC row column, the one on the left, remember that's the north-south moisture transport one, you can see the precip heavily sort of centered in Arizona and spreading out from there in terms of the relationship. And if you go to the second column, that's our relationship for PC2, which again was that diagonal southwest and northeast signal in the LBDA. And we see in the extreme precipitation pretty strong correlation centered over, I'd say, LA, and then sort of puncturing into the interior. And some of these areas, the correlation is pretty strong given that we're trying to relate it to extreme precipitation. So some of the highest values there can get up to 0.6, and I think one was even approaching 0.7 in terms of correlation. So it's not, and we're not doing too bad. And on that last column, we just combine PC1 and 2 to see if we can better predict these same variables. So, we feel like we're doing okay. We're feeling we could take these spatial patterns in the LBDA and relate them to extreme precipitation, but we know that precip is being delivered to this area not in the form of extremes as well. The trees are picking that up. So likely, any remaining noise in the signal is related to precip under that 99.5th percentile threshold that we set. And so what this plot is showing is how much, as a fraction of the total precip delivered to an area in a year, is delivered by precip over a particular quantile or over a particular threshold. So here we have for the 85th percentile in the Southwest, basically all precip in this area is delivered by precip that's over the 85th percentile. Everything else below the 85th percentile is basically zero precip. And so you can kind of march along all the way to the 99.5th percentile, where most of the region is getting about 10% of its precip from those extremes, but there are areas, particularly in the Southwest, that get almost upwards of 40% of their precip by this very extreme precip. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just show that if we were to ease up on our extreme precip threshold, make it a little lower, maybe the 90th percentile, we can pick up more signal. And so that's exactly what's being shown here. The right plot is what I showed before, the relationship between PC1 and 2 and occurrences and magnitudes of the 99.5th percentile precip. On the left, we have the same thing for the 90th. You can see the relationship gets stronger. Basically, if you ease up on how you define extremes, you can get a better signal. So the last thing I want to show is we can also use these PCs and try and reconstruct the occurrence of landfalling ARs on the western U.S. coastline. So this is a really cool data set put out by Swen Brands in 2017. He divided the western U.S. coast into a couple of regions and then just counted the number of ARs that hit that region. So we're going to look at, and so some of those maps of those trajectories are on the right. We're going to look at a count of ARs falling on region 1, which is the Southwest, and we're going to relate it to our PCs, and we do okay. We don't do so bad. So the bottom there is the number of AR occurrences in that data set. On the y-axis is our predictions of that. I'll note that we played some games about how ARs are defined, so you can sort of optimize how you define ARs to improve this relationship. And then finally, we can use this relationship to try and reconstruct the occurrence of landfalling atmospheric rivers on that southwest area. And that's what's being shown here. So the red is the observed historical AR landfalls on the southwest, and the black with the gray uncertainty bounds is our reconstruction. And just for the sake of time, I'll just highlight a couple things. One, our reconstruction picks up some key times when LA has seen some pretty big floods, so that's encouraging. And our reconstruction also picks up a time where we know it was particularly dry all on the West Coast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end with this idea of trying to extend this method to the rest of the West. So if you look in the left plot there, that is LBDA reconstruction of the PDSI for 1961. The black is extreme precip that occurred. And what you can see, all that blue means it was very, very dry. But in the Pacific Northwest, you can see this band of white. It might be hard for you to see. Basically, you might see this filamentary structure in the LBDA for the Pacific Northwest as well, which is where several ARs came in during that same time. So we might be able to extend this to the northwest, but likely we're going to need to separate out cold season and warm season signals a bit better with chronologies that are specific for them. So with that, I'll conclude, skip this because I'm out of time, and just say thanks. All right.
Thank you. Time for one short question. I guess not?
Nope.
Okay, thanks, Scott.
Okay, our next speaker is Samuel Munoz, Climatic and Anthropogenic Controls on Mississippi River Floods, a multi-proxy paleoflood approach.
Hey, I'm Sam Munoz. I'm at Northeastern University. I just moved there from Hui. And today I'm going to be talking to you about work that we're doing reconstructing flooding on the Mississippi River. And to do this, we're using both sedimentary records from floodplain lakes, as well as tree ring records from the floodplain itself. And I'll just sort of give you the big takeaways. There are two things that this record can help us do. The first is letting us identify quite clearly the role of ocean forcing in both the Pacific and the Atlantic in really modulating flow and flood risk on this massive river system, the Mississippi. And second, it's allowing us to place recent historic floods in a longer-term context. And when we do that, what we see is that flood magnitudes have really increased significantly over the last century. And it basically means that the largest historic floods that we've seen recently are unprecedented within the last 500 years. And the reason for this really seems to be not driven by changes in the climate system, but changes to the geomorphology of the river that we as people have sort of brought upon it with this really aggressive river engineering that we've done to the Mississippi. So what's the motivation behind this work? To put it very simply, flooding is bad, right? It's bad for people. It's one of the costliest and most common types of natural hazards that we face. And I'd argue that we're not very good at evaluating the risk of these kinds of extremes, right? We are regularly caught off guard by some historically unprecedented event. And the reason for this, at least in part, stems from the way that we try to predict the probability of these kinds of events, which is that we take short instrumental records and we statistically extrapolate them. And we assume stationarity, so we assume that the likelihood of an event like this is the same today as it was 50 years ago, as it will be 50 years in the future. But of course, this isn't a very good set of assumptions because we know that the main controls on flooding, atmospheric processes and geomorphic processes, aren't stable, right? And so we're left with this situation and repetitive situations like what we just saw in Texas. And so this is this really ripe place for paleo to come in, right? We have this long-term perspective. And so paleoflood hydrology, this is a term for a field that was coined by Vic Baker in the 1980s, which is basically using proxy records to reconstruct flooding over long time periods. And this was really an applied field meant to address this problem. And so Vic and his colleagues initially worked in environments just like this one. This is a bedrock canyon in the American Southwest. And what they were doing was when a river like this rises, it will leave a little sediment deposit up high, and they could date those. And then because the channel's stable, they could use simple hydraulics and figure out the magnitude of that event, right? This was awesome. This is revolutionary work. But it was really limited to this kind of environment. But if we're thinking about flood risk and flood hazard, right, we really would like to know more about these kind of environments. The environment that we're in right now in New Orleans, these are low gradient rivers, and this is where people tend to concentrate. We have been living in these kind of environments for millennia, right? This is where we live, we have shipping, we have industry, we have farms, and so when these kind of systems flood, it's expensive, right? So we'd like to know about that. And so in the last few years, there have been a few advances in paleoflood hydrology that let us do paleoflood work in these kind of environments. I'm going to talk about those. Right? The first, which is the one that I sort of, on this team, is sort of my bread and butter, is we're using floodplain lakes, sediment records from floodplain lakes, right? And so this is a field site of ours. This is Lake Mary in Mississippi. It's about 2 hours north of here. And so Lake Mary forms from a cutoff of the Mississippi in about 1776. And we know that these oxbow lakes, when they form pretty quickly, within about a decade, they form these plugs, what geomorphologists call plugs, right at the sort of top and bottom where it used to connect with the channel. And these are basically formed with sediment and vegetation. And what those plugs do is they basically mean that there's no more exchange of coarse bedload material from the river to the lake during sort of normal flow conditions. But then what happens if you have a major flood is suddenly you'll have a little bit of sediment that'll make its way over from the main channel into the lake itself, right? And so when we core these lakes, we can see these what paleotempestologists call event beds, right? Basically coarse-grained beds that represent, at least in theory, past floods. And so this is a sediment core just of the very, very, very top of the Lake Mary, of a core from Lake Mary. So we're just looking at the top 20 centimeters. This is an 8-meter long core that represents 200 years, so insanely high sedimentation rates, right? But if we just look at the very, very top, we cored this in 2016. Right before we got there, there had been a flood that had occurred, and the flood of record is in 2011 on this particular section of the river. And so what we can see, this is a radiograph. We have these dense bands. It's a coarser band, right? And we can date these. We basically throw everything at these to date them. We do lead 210, cesium 137, OSL, and a little bit of radiocarbon, and throw that all into a Bacon age model, and it allows us to estimate with pretty good precision the timing of these events. And so in this case, we have an event that's more than likely the 2016 event, and then we have the 2011 event below it. And if we keep going down, we can repeat this process for the entire record, right? The other really cool part of this is that we think we can also reconstruct not just when floods occurred, but also the magnitude of those floods. So how much water was actually flowing that left this deposit. And that's just because we expect that there would be a relationship between the texture of a deposit, right, how coarse it is, and the magnitude of the flood that left it. And sure enough, when we do this at Lake Mary and we do this at all of our sites, we see this reasonably nice linear relationship between historic floods that we know the discharge of, right? These are things that happen once we had instrumental records, and the coarseness, the grain size of that event. And so then we can use this relationship to basically reconstruct discharge on all of our records. Right, the other part of this is the tree ring side, which I'm not a tree ring person. This is Matt Therrell's thing, and he's in this room somewhere. So if you have really specific questions about it, ask him. But basically, the idea here is that trees in the floodplain, when they get inundated for more than a few days, like a week or something, that ring will show signs of injury. And so people like Matt can go back and find these signs of injury, and then when they stack those up, it corresponds really nicely with years of known flood events. And so what this is these are really nice because it gives us the year that a flood occurred, right, with a lot of precision, way more precision than we can ever get with a sediment record. But at this point, we can't see flood magnitudes with these, but we can do the timing with a lot of precision. And we also miss winter floods in these because they're outside the growing season, so the trees don't see them. But winter floods on this particular section of the Mississippi are pretty rare, so we're only really missing a few historic ones. All right, so we can put all these together. At this point, we've got 3 sediment records, MRY, FLR, STJ. BOT is the tree ring record. And so we're plotting over time, over the last 500 years, we're plotting flood frequency on the top and flood magnitude on the bottom. Flood frequency is just the number of events that we're seeing. In this case, we're using a 31-year window. So just the number of events in a 31-year window. And flood magnitude is the actual size of those events, right? So the first question we should ask ourselves is, are these proxy records doing a good job? And so we can look at just the instrumental period, the last century or so. The black line is the instrumental flood frequency, and the red line is the average of all of our proxy records, right? So yeah, I think we're doing a pretty good job of reconstructing this. Same thing with magnitudes, right? We'd expect that our reconstruction, because it's calibrated on each other, the range of values are going to be similar, but we wouldn't expect, if it was doing a bad job, to have this sort of similar trends between the two. So these are just lowest curves. Again, the red line is a reconstructed, and the black is the instrumental. Right, so then when we look back on this, we go back on time and we look at the entire record, what do we see? There are a couple things I want to point out. The first is that we have these sort of multi-decadal oscillations, both in flood frequency and in flood magnitude, right? And the second thing is that we have this increase, really, over the last century or so in flood frequency and flood magnitude, right? So let's sort of pull that apart and try and understand what's driving all this. Right, so the first thing we want to go to is climate. What's climate doing over this time, and does that have any explanatory power? And I don't really have time to get into it, but Sylvia D. and I published a paper earlier this year where we really looked at this in CESM and some reanalysis data sets to really try and get at the mechanism, at least theoretically. And that paper, we showed that at least theoretically, we showed that floods on the Mississippi really arise through the interaction of the Pacific and the Atlantic, where the Pacific's really controlling sort of antecedent moisture, soil moisture, and these big storms coming from the Gulf of Mexico are really sort of the trigger between those two. And so what the paleo data is showing is that, at least the models are doing a pretty good job of that. So we basically see really nice correlations between our flood frequency down here, this is the same thing that you just saw a minute ago, and El Nino event frequency. This Pearson correlation is really high. If we just look at ENSO reconstructions, it's still high and still significant, but this is particularly good. And then the AMO. And again, we have a pretty good negative relationship between the AMO and our flood frequency. And I'll also point out, as far as magnitudes go, when we look at magnitudes, ENSO really falls out as a good predictor of magnitudes, but AMO is really good. If we're looking in the period before people really started messing with the river, AMO is a pretty good predictor of how big a flood will be. And this makes sense because, again, the sort of trigger of these events is Atlantic source. So we probably wouldn't expect that just sort of antecedent moisture brought in by the Pacific would be particularly good predictor of magnitude. All right. So what about that big increase in flood magnitudes that I mentioned before, right? So on the left here, we're looking at all our magnitude reconstructions going back over the last 500 years, right? This red line, so all the gray dots are floods. The red line is just saying, if I was standing in the year 1700 and I look back over the last 100 years, what would have been the biggest flood in that time that I would have seen, right? So this does a nice job of illustrating the sort of increase in flood magnitudes we're seeing. A better way to do this that's less sensitive to just sort of individual events is to actually go ahead and calculate what the 100-year flood is, right? So this is, a 100-year flood is a flood that has a 1% chance of being exceeded in any given year, right? And so we can look at what the 100-year flood was sort of in the baseline before people really started engineering the Mississippi, and then we can look at what it is today. And when we do that, we see that there's like this 20% increase in the magnitude of the 100-year flood over this time. And so what's driving this, right? Well, we know what we're seeing, and we know what the climate system did over this time. We know what the AMO did, so we can basically just regress AMO and sort of shoot that forward and say, well, what happens in a world where engineers never existed? If this was just a purely climate-driven signal, and when we do that, we get this blue line, right? So when we do that, we only really get an increase in the 100-year flood by about 5%, right? So there's this big unexplained increase that is not well explained by the climate system, and so the likely cause of that is basically changes in the geomorphology of the Mississippi. And you may know this, you may not, but the Mississippi is one of the largest public works projects in human history. We have invested billions and billions of dollars to basically modify this system to improve navigation and, ironically, protect us against flooding, right? So we've built levees that basically channelize the whole thing. We've shortened the river by making artificial cutoffs, and we basically encase the whole thing in concrete with these so-called revetments. And so what this has done is basically speed the propagation of a flood downstream so that what would have been a sort of moderate event becomes a pretty dramatic event today. So with my remaining minute, I'll say I just moved to Northeastern University. I'm building a sediment lab out at our really scenic Marine Science Center, which is on a little peninsula that sticks out into Boston Harbor. It's a great spot. If you are a student and you think this looks cool, get in touch with me. I'm recruiting students, and if you have great students, please send them my way. I'll be around today and tomorrow, and I'm on Twitter and email and all that stuff. And so with that, thanks to the co-authors and all our help doing this work. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sam. Excellent talk. There is time for questions.
Yeah, Nathan.
Nathan.
Where did your AMO and ENSO reconstruction come from?
Oh yeah, so that,
Sensitive to your choice of
yeah. So the AMO is the gray reconstruction, and then it's the instrumental over the last 150 years. The ENSO, we didn't want to pick one because I know that's a whole thing. So it's basically just the average of all of them. And we can talk about whether that's a reasonable thing to do or not, but it seems to work. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep. Scott.
I've had a few Army Corps people come to a talk or two, but they're the sort of like progressive Army Corps types. So they're interested. I've really tried to sort of reach out to try and get funding from them, and so far that hasn't really panned out. They're sort of just hasn't worked out yet.
Okay, we better move on now. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Juggle. I think it's PC.
Not working?
No, it's fine. I'm just juggle. Okay, great. Our next talk is by Margaret Christie, Vegetation Change and Pollen Geochronology from the Atlantic Coast of the United States during the last millennium.
Thank you for having me to this talk, and I also would like to thank my co-authors for all of their help in getting me here, I guess. So what we did was we worked to produce a database of pollen history for the United States Atlantic coast, and primarily in this talk I'm going to focus on pollen changes following European settlement, so things related to agriculture and logging and other events such as those. We also worked to see if pollen geochronometers are accurate age markers, so how do they correspond to other geochronometers such as pollution horizons and radiocarbon dating. And finally, we worked to determine whether the timing of anthropogenic impacts on the coastal vegetation varies along the Atlantic coast, and if so, how. So why is pollen important? Why do we care about this geochronometer? Well, there's a plateau in the calibration curve of radiocarbon that limits its use to for the last 350 years. And we also have pollution markers that are related to human activities, but they only occur after industrialization. So we have this gap in the middle here, which is important for a lot of sea level research and climate change research, where we don't have all that many good chronometers other than pollen. So pollen fills in a very important gap. So we want to make sure that it works well and that we know what we're looking at and understand how it interacts with the other geochronometers. So we looked at, so far, 6 coastal salt marshes located from Connecticut to Florida in order to try and figure out how well it fits with other geochronometers and how it impacts age depth models. But for this talk, I'm only going to focus on the northernmost site in East River, Connecticut, and the southernmost site in Nassau Landing, Florida, just in the interest of time. Each of the sites, however, includes a composite chronology, which includes, of course, pollen, but also pollution history and radiocarbon dating, as well as a pollen history for a core from that site. We analyzed the chronology 2 times, once using the pollen chronohorizons and once without the pollen chronohorizons, using BCHRON, which is a Bayesian age depth model. So the first site that I'm going to talk about today is the southernmost site, located in Nassau Landing, Florida. And this site involved a core taken up the Nassau River, which is a tidal river, and it was taken in a salt marsh in order to reconstruct sea level history in this region. This is the complete age depth model for Nassau Landing, Florida, from the cores taken there. And on the y-axis, you can see the depth of the core in centimeters, and the x-axis, we have the year that the sediment was deposited. We have several pollution markers that we used in this age depth model, as well as radiocarbon and pollen. But because I'm only focusing for this talk on pollen horizons that took place after European settlement, I'm only going to focus on the top portion of this model. So here you can see both runs of the model with pollen, without pollen, and then a comparison. The model without pollen is located on the left side of the figure and is in blue. When we included pollen, which is noted in the large red dots, in the center model, it's the 95% confidence interval is in pink, and then we compared them, and where they overlap each other is purple. And you can see in the overlap that there is a slight improvement where the model is a little bit narrower where the pollen is located, and you can see that because there's a little bit of blue that outlines the purple that makes up most of the 95% confidence interval. So in this case, the pollen improved the age depth model versus without having pollen. So here you can see the actual pollen abundances for that site at Nassau Landing in Florida. We have the B-cron predicted age not using pollen as the y-axis here, and the pollen abundance for several key species in identifying horizons, as well as the ratio of quercus, which is oak, to ambrosia, which is ragweed. So at this site, there were 2 pollen horizons that we could find in the core. The more recent one is the increase in agriculture, which in Florida occurred around 1935, plus or minus 10 years. And it can be seen here by a peak in ambrosia, the beginning of a decline in pine, and a low quercus to ambrosia ratio. At this depth, the B-cron age range predicts that the age of the sediment would be from 1938 to 1955. So we did have an overlap between the pollen age and its variation, as well as the B-cron age range, 2 sigma. So the second pollen horizon that we found was the spread of railroads in 1865, plus or minus 15 years. And that can be seen by a decrease in oak and the beginning of the increase in ambrosia. And the B-cron age range at that depth was found to be from 1873 to 1918. So once again, we had an overlap. One thing to note about these overlaps, however, is that the pollen tends to be in the lower side of the B-cron age range given, which indicates that the pollen is a little bit higher in the core than we might expect it to be. And I'm going to go back to that towards the end of the talk and why that may have occurred. Our second site, located at East River, Connecticut, was similarly taken from a core in a tidal salt marsh, in this case located off of Long Island Sound, and was used for sea level rise reconstructions as well. This is the complete age depth model for the core at this site, which once again used several pollution markers as well as radiocarbon and pollen in order to construct the geochronology here. And once again, we're only focusing on the top portion of the core, in this case about the most recent 500 years, because that's the region of the core where the pollen horizons are located, and so the part of the core that would be improved by having them. Here we see the comparison of the models without pollen, with pollen, and how well they fit each other. Once again, with the model without pollen being located on the left, the model with pollen located in the middle, and the comparison on the right. And in this case, there were much larger improvements in the model. The pink model is 95% confidence interval is much thinner than the blue 95% confidence interval, particularly related to these two, less so related to this one, but as you'll notice in the next slide, this pollen horizon didn't work out as well as some of the others. So here's the pollen abundance diagram for East River, Connecticut, and once again we have B-cron predicted age without pollen on the y-axis, and the percent abundance for several key species, and the ratio of quercus to ambrosia. In this case, while the pollen is clearly a little bit less cut and dry than the previous slide, we were still able to find 3 pollen chronohorizons. The most recent one in this case was the chestnut blight, which is supposed to have occurred around 1920, plus or minus 10 years. We found it here as a decline in Castanea, which is chestnut. However, the B-cron age range for that depth is 1954 to 1972, so this didn't overlap. In the second pollen corona horizon is logging, which in this region took place around 1800 plus or minus 20 years, and can be seen by a decrease in Castanea, a decrease in pine, and the start of the decrease in oak. And this did overlap with the B-cron age range at its depth of 1728 to 1826. So we did have overlap in logging. And the earliest pollen corona horizon is settlement, which is indicated by the increase in agriculture and an initial land clearance, and took place around 1700 plus or minus 60 years in this region. And in this core, we determined that its location was at the highest peak of Ambrosia, which has, at the same depth, a B-cron age range of 1532 to 1691. When we look at all 6 of the sites that we've analyzed so far, we found that in 10 out of 14 cases, the pollen horizons overlapped the 95% confidence interval of the age depth model, and that pollen narrowed the 95% confidence interval at depths between pollen horizons and radiocarbon dating at 5 of the 6 sites. At the 6th site, which is located in southern New Jersey, we have maybe, because it seems to have shifted, but we're not quite sure if it's more narrow or less narrow at this point. So in conclusion, pollen is a helpful chronometer between radiocarbon and pollution horizons. However, the pollen horizons tended to be slightly higher in the core than expected based on the age depth models. And in the cases where they didn't match, it was definitely higher than the age depth model. And there's 2 possible reasons for this. The first is lag time. These pollen events didn't happen all at once. All of the trees didn't get cut down overnight, but instead may have taken place over a number of years. Additionally, the event timing could have varied within regions. So some regions may have had for example, logging occur later than other regions, which may have caused the pollen to appear higher in the core, the pollen horizon to appear higher in the core than diaries may have indicated. Additionally, we may have missed some of the events. The sampling interval results in one sample being taken above the pollen abundance change associated with an event and another taken below. So if the sample is assigned to the higher of these 2 samples, or if the sample above is assigned to the horizon, it would make it appear as if the horizon is higher in the core than we would expect. So we are still working on analyzing a couple cores. We have 4 or more samples that we're still looking at in order to do this. And additionally, we're working on statistically determining the difference between the model with and without pollen, as well as how well the pollen fits with the B-cron age range at its site, how well those 2 distributions fit. So that's future work that we're still moving forward with. I want to thank you for coming to my talk.
Thank you very much. We have ample time for questions. Anybody?
Sure.
Oh,
Do you have an explanation of why your age depth relationship changes between the radiocarbon and all the indicators that you use? Like the changes in film is quite as the radiocarbon pollen change.
So you're asking why it changes between radiocarbon and the other model, yeah. So a possible reason for that is many of the other geochronometers take place after human settlement, after European settlement, so there could have been deforestation. So sedimentation rates could have increased, which may have changed.
question?
The potential for other pollen horizons that would use that would be pre-European. Is there anything deeper in the core that's not changing this?
That's actually something else that I'm working on as I'm combing through the literature and looking for additional pollen horizons, both pre-European settlement and post-European settlement, that may be able to be used as geochronometers.
Any more questions?
There's one over there.
Yes.
I was wondering sort of what your sources for the information about those time horizons, just because, I don't know, it seems like that's a place where you could maybe refine for more local time.
Yeah, so the sources of the pollen horizons are mostly from other papers that have used different almanacs and diaries as to, for example, like perhaps at some point there was a wood shortage related with all of the land being cleared, and someone may have written down like, oh, we can't find firewood starting this year. So it's mainly those sorts of things that we get that information from. But there's a whole bunch of sources, and I'm trying to kind of combine them into one place as well.
We have time for one more question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, salt marshes they can be dynamic. Do you think you can expand your timing envelopes to incorporate bioconservation or reworking?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll have to look more into that. Yeah, it may match up better. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on now.
Okay, the next speaker is Jessie Pearl, talking about dendroclimate evidence for extreme hydrologic events over the late Holocene in the northeastern United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizers for having me today. So today I'm going to talk about some of the dendroclimatic evidence we have at the very turn of the Common Era in the northeastern United States for both extreme and regional hydroclimate. And the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce you to our principal actor in this story, the Atlantic white cedar. So Atlantic white cedar is a tree that lives in freshwater swamps going from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up towards Maine. And importantly, for dendroclimatologists like myself, over the past 2 decades has been a principal component for reconstructing climate for the region over the past 200 or so years. And as such, we're looking to extend these reconstructions even further back in time by obtaining subfossil wood collections so that we can really extend the climate reconstructions back beyond the 1700s and into deeper times. So we're moving over to the northeastern United States once again, north of New York City and south of Boston on this landform of Cape Cod. So Cape Cod is a glacially formed landform. It is mostly moraine sediment and outwash sediment. And in the star is at the very armpit of the arm of the Cape is where this field site is. And as it is a glacially formed landmass, about 14,000 years ago when the glacier retreated from the area, it left behind large blocks of ice which have since melted out and become these topographic lows in the landscape of kettle holes and kettle lakes. And Atlantic white cedar preferentially grows in these environments. It outcompetes any other species in the region for these kettle holes and kettle lakes, and they're now ombotrophic swamps. So they're rain-fed swamps, which means that very little fresh water from the ground is penetrating through that till into the swamps, and there's not much runoff that also feeds the swamps. So we think of these environments that these particular Atlantic white cedar are in as a great precipitation proxy for the region. And when we're looking for ancient kettle holes to collect these subfossil collections, they're pretty easy to see even from space as these rounded coastline features when you have these ancient kettle holes and these ancient cedar swamps falling into the ocean. And this particular site is called Comquisset. So we don't only have our visual evidence that a cedar forest used to stand here, but we also have the oral tradition of the Nipmuc that says this was a place of small pines, the pond of small pines. It used to be a freshwater swamp here. And here's another view of the site, and I just want to orient you a little bit to our field site. So we have the front basin, which is at high tide in this picture, where we collected all of our subfossil wood. We have the back basin, which is currently covered in reeds, where we took a 9.5 meter peat core in the red dot. At the Ninja Star in blue, in between, we took a sediment core at the sill in between these two basins. And here we are out collecting our subfossil wood. So this is as if you were in the ocean looking inwards. So you're looking at the front basin, the Phragmites, the reeds at the back, in the back basin, and the sill in between. And from our subfossil collection, we were able to obtain quite a few really beautifully preserved Atlantic white cedar specimens. And because they were so well preserved, we were able to measure their ring width and both visually and statistically cross-date the trees and to create, kind of lock them in within each other into their cohorts. One thing I would like to mention at this slide is that due to tidal activity, so the continuous submersion of the samples, and then exposure to the air, as well as microorganisms, as well as macro marine organisms like barnacles, we're missing anywhere, we estimate, between 5 and 10, or 5 to 20 years. So none of these samples had their original bark. We think that these processes, so probably stripped off anywhere between 5 to 20 rings, and as such, when we look at our reconstructions or our chronologies from these samples, they're probably a lot younger than we actually, they're probably a little bit older than we actually see them to be. We also took sediment and peat cores from the area to further constrain our knowledge of what happened here. And then we took all of the wood that we had and brought them back into the lab to do radiocarbon analysis on them. So we don't only have radiocarbon dates from each specific specimen, we also have radiocarbon dates for both the inner and outermost rings for many of these specimens. And because of that, because we know exactly how many years are in between these two radiocarbon dates, we can use Bayesian modeling to further constrain the age ranges on many of these samples. And because of both the properties of tree rings, that they're annually resolved, as well as these radiocarbon measurements, we were able to create this subfossil chronology. So this is really exciting for us in that, yes, we can actually create a subfossil chronology out of Atlantic white cedar wood in this region, but also thinking about it as a paleo precipitation proxy going further back in time to have a possible hydroclimate reconstruction that could span these years is a really novel thing for this region. So the chronology goes from about 312 BCE all the way to 220 CE, and we have a plus or minus of about 13 years on the entire length of the chronology. Now, one thing we noticed that we thought was interesting when we were creating this chronology is right at the time when all of the modern cohort of trees seem to die, seem to perish, we also have the very last evidence of cedar in the entire area. So the peat core that we took had its last evidence of Atlantic white cedar around the exact same time as we see the end of this chronology. So the question then became, why did this Atlantic white cedar forest die? And we have 3 hypotheses. All 3 of these hypotheses are mechanisms that would introduce toxic saline water into these freshwater swamps, thereby killing them. The first is long-term sea level change. The second are erosional processes like longshore drift, and the third being storms. So our first hypothesis is sea level change. When the Atlantic white cedar first colonized this swamp about 4,000 years ago, sea level was 2.5 to 3 meters below present value. However, when the swamp died around 230 CE, we see that sea level was about 0.2 meters below present value, but the rate of change was 0 millimeters per year. Our second hypothesis is longshore drift. As I mentioned, Cape Cod is created mostly of till. It's a lot of sand, and so wave action is highly influential on these landform. Longshore drift can happen on longer timescales, like the actual formation of the shape of the arm of the cape, as well as more abrupt timescales, like you're seeing here at the tip of Chatham, in these breakthrough events where you get an introduction of a lot of marine water into the back area. And our very third hypothesis is a large event like a hurricane. So yes, in the northeastern United States, we do get hurricanes. This is Hurricane Bob in 1991. It was a Category 1 to 2 storm that made landfall in Massachusetts. And just to orient you, in the star is my field site. So to get a better understanding of the effect of ancient hurricanes on this ancient swamp, we traveled 2.5 kilometers away to Salt Pond, where Jeff Donnelly and his Coastal Systems group at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute have poked many, many holes and have created a really wonderful record of events for this region of the Cape. So what you're looking at here is the event deposits in Salt Pond. On the y-axis, you have the coarse grain percentage. We think of the coarse grain percentage as an indicator of a higher energetic environment. So the higher the energy, the coarser grain you can deposit into this pond. And in this particular context, it's interpreted as hurricanes. So here's Hurricane Bob all the way at 1991. You see that there's a period of high hurricane activity in the 15 and 1600s, a very large extreme event in the 500s or so. But what I'm actually most interested in are these two events at the very beginning of the record. And the reason I'm interested in them is because when you take these two events with the published dates from this particular event record, and you lay them on top of my subfossil wood chronology, what you see is that the higher event, the 14.8% coarse event, lines almost perfectly up with the death of my cedars. And once again, pointing out that the tree ring chronology can move back and forth 13 years, but is fixed in time in place in terms of between the years. And the actual salt pond course plots at any point in the age model can wiggle around 60 to even 150 years. So what we decided to do is we decided to run 10,000 iterations of the age model, looking at this particular event, which we think might actually be the doom for this swamp. And we wanted to see what the general probability was that this particular event was what fell on the same time period as the end of my swamp. And what we find is at the very end of this core, the very beginning of the salt pond core, the age constraints aren't really tight enough to get a good idea as the probability of this event being around the same time as the end of the cedar swamp. And so because we couldn't really constrain as nicely as we wanted to the ages on this particular event, we decided to turn to our sill data. So we took an XRF scan of our sill sediment core in Quamquisset. And one thing that immediately jumps out to me is that you see this really abrupt transition into a higher energy environment. So what I'm showing you here, the top of the core is at the top of the slide, and the bottom of the core is at the bottom. And what I'm showing are kind of more classic indicators of a higher energy environment, larger grain size, and more sand. So what we interpret this to be as a period of a quiescence in this quiet ambitrophic swamp, all of a sudden a large jump into a much more energetic and marine environment. So now, in this really dynamic coastal environment where you have these brave Atlantic white cedar trees that are feeling the brunt of Atlantic storms as well as regional hydroclimate, we're really encouraged that we have abundant both living and subfossil wood to possibly create longer-term precipitation reconstructions for the region. Quamquisset in general is a particularly ideal location to study both the long and short-term climatological as well as geomorphological effects of large events like hurricanes and longshore drift, and its effect on the coastline as well as the ecosystems that are behind these barrier environments. And currently, the way our evidence stands, we are most convinced that it was some sort of large event that introduced this toxic saline water into these freshwater swamps, killing the trees and then breaking that coastline open to marine influence. So both the back basin and the front basin are now tidally forced, and we think that it was probably some sort of large storm event like a hurricane that really kicked these, or broke through the protection of any sort of sand barrier and then killing the swamps. And with that, I would like to thank all of the people who helped with this work, not only in the field, but as well as funding, and Ms. Susan Morse, whose land we trampled all over and parked our car onto many times over the past 2 years. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. We have time for questions. Yes.
Do you have any insights of sites further south, like much further south, that would experience really common hurricanes?
Much further south?
Gulf Coast, maybe?
So I primarily work in the Northeastern United States. There has been a lot of really interesting paleotempest work in the Gulf Coast, looking at trees as well as the effects on storms and how that affects fire regimes, and then how fire regimes affect the trees in the area. But I'm not as familiar with the Gulf Coast.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Beck.
I think I heard that. Are you asking if the increase in silica is also can be interpreted as longshore drift? Yeah, so we can't actually rule out any of the hypotheses that I originally posed. And longshore drift, because it is such a dynamic component to the entire landform of Cape Cod, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying it's not that. Since it is tucked into it's not immediately on the Atlantic side. I don't know if it's going to be as much of a drastic effect in this region, but yeah, it's not something that we can rule out. Absolutely.
Time for one more question.
Jessie.
Oh,
Outside of a terminal hurricane event, do you see the White Cedar record working as a record of previous hurricanes that might not have damaged it to mortality, but actually something that you can use for hurricane reconstructions alongside the other records that we have?
Yeah, that's the hope. But we have looked at a couple different things. We've done a superposed epoch analysis on tree ring width for some of the swamps that have felt the effects of hurricanes over the years. And we do see a relationship to a negative relationship to a smaller ring the year after a hurricane. We've also looked at oxygen 18 and looking at any sort of depletion mark in the tree rings. We haven't really seen anything super obvious at this point, but we still have to do some digging to figure out if there's that sort of signature of a large-scale hurricane event. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to move on to the next talk.
All right, the next talk, there is the man, the myth, the legend. The next talk is by Dave Stahle, Tree Ring Reconstruction of Wet Season Rainfall Totals in the Amazon.
Well, thank you very much. Tree rings and rainfall in the Amazon. Our goal is to use tree rings to reconstruct rainfall in the Amazon because it's there. You know, it's the center of deep atmospheric convection. It's an amazing ecosystem and, of course, the largest river on Earth. And so today we're going to report our initial results. It's a collaboration between the University of Arkansas, colleagues at the Federal University at Lavras in Brazil, CONICET in Mendoza, Argentina, and the National Institute of Amazonian Research in Manaus. And we're looking here at a photo of the cut front on the Rio Xingu in the eastern Amazon. And of course, this is the very controversial Belo Monte hydroelectric project, you know, that was put in on the Xingu and the big bend of the Xingu River. And it's, of course, a tragedy in so many ways that such a vast area of forest had to be felled. But we opportunistically have gone there and to other construction sites and have obtained cross-sections from a series of tropical hardwoods for the purposes of dendrochronology. Let's see. No. So the problem, there's several, but one of the problems we're interested in, of course, is the intensification of the hydrologic cycle in the Amazon. And I see that the time series doesn't project too good here out of Manuel Glor et al.'s paper, but it's a time series showing the amplification of the seasonal cycle. So the difference in discharge in the Amazon between the wet season flow and the dry season flow. And so there's been a trend in that in maybe the last 40 years or so. And, you know, so floods are getting deeper and droughts are being more severe and sustained, you know, and this is also reflected to some extent in the discharges, the straight up discharge of the Amazon River. And this is measured, by the way, at Obidos, which reflects about 70% of the runoff from the basin. It's not as long as the longest record, which is recorded at the port of Manaus, the junction of the Solimões and the Rio Negro to form the Amazon, the way the Brazilians look at it. And that's certainly the most important hydroclimatic record in all of Amazonia. And they have used Manaus to actually estimate the early years of flow at Óbidos, and it's just not showing up too well. But the Manaus record, the Rio Negro record, is super important. We also have precipitation data from the basin. It's not as good as we wish, and the precipitation data is also showing some trend in recent years. And so there's a number of hypotheses for this, including deforestation, of course, but also potentially anthropogenic climate change, the idea of a warming tropical North Atlantic leading to greater moisture advection into Amazonia, especially in the dry season. Decadal changes in Pacific SSTs have been hypothesized. There could be great natural variability at multi-decadal timescales that we're only beginning to understand. And of course, there's certainly data quality issues involved here. So this is a major question that potentially tree rings might provide some insight into. And so this is a time series of the second longest rainfall record, direct instrumental rainfall record in Amazonia. The longest is in Rio Branco. It's in the far extreme western basin. It starts in 1892. Manaus began in 1903, and it's got data problems. If you do a double mass analysis between the Manaus rainfall data for the wet season and wet season discharge from the Rio Negro, it's inhomogeneous. And so is the dry season. So are the dry season precipitation totals versus dry season discharge at Manaus. So, you know, the rainfall, the instrumental precipitation record for Amazonia is really extremely limited, you know, before about 1950. And even some of the longest records have problems, data quality problems. So this is the ideal setting for tree rings. Here's where tree rings at least, you know, might be able to provide some seasonal insight in the pre-instrumental era. The other problem, of course, is we don't have many tree rings, you know, in the Amazon or anywhere in the global tropics down here. This is a map of all the tree ring chronologies that exactly dated that have been contributed to the International Tree Ring Data Bank. And so we're going to report about the chronologies that Lidio Lopez, who's here today, has developed in the Bolivian portion of the southern Amazon basin from, say, Hato woodlands, seasonally dry woodlands in the southern Amazon basin. He's made several tree ring chronologies, and we've published on those. And we've made a chronology now in the eastern Amazon. The problem, of course, here in the most biodiverse forests in the world is that most of these native trees in the tropics do not produce annual rings, and so they cannot be confidently dated with dendrochronology. And so our big success so far has been made thanks to Lidio and to Daniela, you know, who's getting her PhD at Lavras. So just a little bit of background, because this impressed me so much when I first started investigating this. Of course, here's the basin of the Amazon. It is the largest river on Earth. It has a basin area almost the size of the continental United States. It has a mean discharge 209 cubic meters per second. That exceeds the combined flow of the next 7 largest rivers on Earth. It's 12 times the discharge of the Mississippi and 414 times the discharge of the Colorado. I mentioned the Colorado, of course, you know, because it's, you know, such a limit. It's an important stream. It's oversubscribed, and some of the most brilliant tree ring work that's ever been published on dendrohydrology has, of course, been based, you know, on the Colorado River. And it is our ambition someday down the road to be able to say something intelligent from the tree ring perspective on the discharge of the Amazon itself. The bathymetry is amazing. It's below sea level, almost 500 kilometers inland near Manaus. You know, so the massive hydrological head, the freshwater hydrological head, is holding at bay the global oceans, essentially, and it's contributing 17%, más o menos, to the freshwater supply to the global ocean. So it's also the largest rainforest on Earth, largest tropical rainforest on Earth, huge. Recent meta-analyses suggest there could be as many 16,000 native tree species in the lowland Amazon. They've actually, okay, so there's 850 in eastern North America, so this is a kind of an educated guess. They've taxonomically described 6,727, so there's like 10,000 unknown species of trees out there still. They estimate almost 400 billion individual trees. I mean, so this is just astounding. And interestingly, out of the 16,000, if you will, maybe 227 of them are widespread. They're found, this is all based on forest plot data, I think about 1,500 forest plots scattered around the Amazon, and then statistical analysis. So they've found these 227 species are found widely. So they're referred to as hyperdominant species, and including the species that we're working on, especially Cedrela odorata. And so this is in triple canopy rainforest over in the eastern Amazon, and the Centralobium microchete, which is in this seasonally dry Cerrado forest of the southern Amazon. So we've made a reconstruction of rainfall, wet season rainfall down here with Lydios data, and a recent one over here in the eastern Amazon. Cores don't work. I mean, increment cores, 5 millimeter diameter cores, non-destructive to the tree. I mean, they're really not suitable for the initial development of rigorous dendrochronology. The rings are not that well defined, even in the best species. And so we're opportunistically getting samples from construction sites and legal logging concessions. And we're also taking, cuts, very abusive cuts, plunge cuts from the trees, but believe it or not, I mean, it's not necessarily fatal, but it's in the interest of trying to develop these chronologies for the first time, and once we get the master dating chronologies established, it may indeed be possible then to just use cores and not have to rely on these cross sections. But we've gathered hundreds of sections now in both the lab in Mendoza, in Munoz, and also in Lavras, and so we're building up an incredible collection. It's going into a permanent archive, and some of it is dating. So the first results for the southern Amazon, this is the correlation between a regional average tree ring chronology of the Centralobium and wet season rainfall totals. The wet season occurs October to March in this portion of the Amazon basin, and this is a extraction of the CRU TS 3.1 precipitation data product. So we averaged, precipitation for the wet season for that box, and you see it plotted here. And this is the result of our calibration of the regional average Centralobium chronologies against it. And we're explaining about half of the variance, and there's large, multi-decadal variability in both the instrumental data and the tree ring data, and you can see that we definitely have data problems, with the instrumental data. It just disappears essentially and relaxes to the mean in the early years. So even though these trees don't get exceptionally old, they could still, provide an interesting, record of precipitation, in maybe the last couple of hundred years. This is the best tree rings I've ever seen in the global tropics. I mean, this is Cedrela odorata from Rio Paru in the eastern Amazon. And so these are just beautiful. And cores would have worked here, probably. These rings are well enough defined. And so this is an exceptionally unusual case. I mean, and we're not really sure why the rings are so vividly, and it's ring porous, semi-ring porous, and we're not really sure why they're so well defined here, because Cedrela odorata can be just useless in many forest environments. So there's a side effect here. Here's some results. These are 10 trees, 27 radii plotted together, the time series, pretty good R-bar statistic. All of the trees from this site date. We have 50 trees from this site. They all date. We took the 10 best. It's got a wet season rainfall response. We can calibrate about 1/3 of the variance against a regional average of rainfall. It's not a great regional average. It's the data end in some critical stations for us in 1990. So we calibrate from like 1939 to 1970 and validate for 20 years thereafter. This is the spatial correlation of our tree ring reconstruction for 1939 to 1970. It's got a very widespread signal in northern South America, essentially, that is much reduced. Afterwards, don't have a good explanation for this. This is triple canopy rainforest. It's not Mesa Verde Douglas fir. We're reasonably happy with the reconstruction, but there are definitely some changes going on here that we're going to simply need more data to try to resolve. And so here finally are the 2 reconstructions that we've prepared so far. Both of them are over 200 years long, 1787 to 2016 in the eastern Amazon. And so these droughts that we see in the calibration period and the validation period in the tree ring record are indeed reflected in the instrumental climate data. And we estimate a drought more severe and sustained than anything seen in the instrumental era. I mean, it's just one chronology, but still, it's interesting. We also indicate some pluvial conditions at the turn of the 20th century. So, I mean, this reconstruction in the eastern Amazon is suggesting some variability we don't see in the modern data. And here's the reconstruction for the southern Amazon more, and you can see the multi-decadal variability here, which is unprecedented in this record, in our view, since 1800. There is no correlation between these 2 reconstructions. I mean, they're 2,000 kilometers apart. That's the distance between California and Alabama, 2 states that are not well correlated on any metric, and so that matters. And also the wet seasons are out of phase. So we got a big job here to fill in the gaps. Thank you very much.
One quick question for Dave. Okay, I guess we'll move on now. Okay, thank you, Dave.
Okay, the next talk is by Allison Lawman, Reconstructing Tropical Southwest Pacific Climate Variability and Mean State Changes at Vanuatu During the Medieval Climate Anomaly Using Geochemical Proxies from Corals.
Thank you very much. The objective of my research group is to reconstruct tropical climate variability across a variety of timescales throughout the late Quaternary using different geological archives. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on reconstructing interannual variability over the Common Era using geochemical proxies from corals. To start out, I'd like to demonstrate our data analysis technique using sea surface temperature from the Niño 3.4 region in the Central Pacific. This top panel shows monthly SST from 1900 to 2005. The bottom panel shows the monthly SST anomalies with respect to the 1961 through 1990 climatology. Now, in order to isolate and focus on interannual variability in the sea surface temperature record, we first apply a 9-year high pass to the monthly data before removing the average annual cycle in order to generate the anomaly series shown here. We see large amplitude anomalies during El Niño and La Niña events. And I'd like to further draw your attention to the gray lines behind the time series that show the 2.5 and 97.5 percentiles. If the data were Gaussian, this would be approximately equal to the plus or minus 2 sigma range. So this is the definition of 2 sigma that I'm going to use throughout the remainder of this talk. In order to quantify the magnitude of variability in the sea surface temperature records, we use histograms and PDFs of the monthly data. This top panel shows the histogram of the monthly SST data from 1900 to 2005, and the black curve shows the probability density function estimate. The bottom panel is showing the distribution of monthly sea surface temperature anomalies. Now, the width of this distribution in the top panel encompasses all of the variability within the monthly time series. So this includes annual, interannual, as well as decadal and longer timescales. If we want to isolate the component of variability at interannual timescales, we can look at the distribution of sea surface temperature anomalies. And the width of this distribution here, and this gray bar represents the plus or minus 2 sigma range as defined by the percentiles, can be used as a metric for the amount of interannual variability. So the occurrence of strong El Nino or La Nina events would add positive and negative SST anomalies into the tails of this distribution, thus elongating the overall width of the PDF and increase the plus or minus 2 sigma range. To demonstrate that the width of a PDF can be used to visualize and quantify the amount of variability in the records, I'm going to show the PDFs for 2 intervals over the 20th century with less ENSO activity and more ENSO activity. Here on the left are the PDFs for 1920 through 1939 in blue. So this is an interval with less ENSO activity that we observe over the 20th century. And the PDF for the monthly sea surface temperatures from 1980 through 1999 is shown in red. So this is a period with more ENSO activity. Now, the length of these bars represent the plus or minus 2 sigma variability as previously defined by the percentiles. These PDFs encompass total variability within the record, so if we want to look at interannual variability, we can look at the distribution of sea surface temperature anomalies between these 2 intervals. We can see that the red curve for the more active ENSO interval is wider than the blue curve, so it's capturing the increase in interannual variability that we see in the latter part of the 20th century. So this technique with the Nino 3.4 region illustrates that we can use PDFs to quantify variability, so we can also apply this to sea surface temperature from the Southwest Pacific. This is also an area that is sensitive to changes in ENSO, and it happens to be where we have corals from. But before getting to the coral-based reconstructions of SST, I first want to show the instrumental SST record for the Republic of Vanuatu, located here in the South Pacific. The top panel shows monthly SST from 1900 to 2005. This is from the gridded Hadai SST product. And the bottom panel shows the monthly SST anomalies with respect to the 1961 to 1990 climatology. Now, Vanuatu is sensitive to changes in ENSO, and we see negative sea surface temperature anomalies occurring during El Nino events and positive sea surface temperature anomalies occurring during La Nina events. Again, the gray bars behind the time series indicate the plus or minus 2 sigma range as previously defined by the percentiles. Here are the histograms for the monthly SST over this 105-year interval and the PDF in black. And again, the width of this distribution encompasses the total variability within the monthly SST record. The bottom shows the histogram of the monthly SST anomalies. And now I'm going to focus on the PDFs for the 2 20-year-long intervals over the 20th century with less ENSO activity and more ENSO activity. Here on the left are the PDFs for the less active ENSO interval and the more active ENSO interval, and the width of this represents total variability. If we look at the component of variability that arises at interannual timescales, we can look at the PDFs for the SST anomalies over these 2 20-year-long intervals. We see that the width of the red curve for the more active ENSO interval is wider than the blue. So this is showing that the instrumental SST products at Vanuatu and in the Southwest Pacific are capturing these changes in ENSO activity over the 20th century. We wanted to further investigate this, though, because we noticed that the difference between the red curve and the blue curve is not as wide as what we observe in the Nino 3.4 region from the Central Pacific. And we see a greater number of anomalies that are closer to 0, which is an explanation for why you see this more peaked shape in the PDFs. So we wanted to see if the number of observations going into the gridded Hadai SST product may play a role in explaining this. To put the observational story into perspective, I'm showing a map of the available observations for the HAD SST3 product for a given month. So December 1929 is shown here as an example. We can see where the ship tracks are, but the takeaway is that there are few observations in the early part of the 20th century for the Southwest Pacific. If we look at the time series of the number of observations as a function of time, note that this is a log scale. Oops, excuse me. We can see that there is sparse coverage in the early part of the 20th century, and it's not until the later half of the 20th century that we start to see an increase in the number of observations. So this provides motivation for why we need additional modern coral records, even for the early part of the 20th century, in order to reconstruct interannual variability in the Southwest Pacific and regions that have sparse data coverage. Fortunately, corals are an archive poised to address this SST data gap. They can provide decades to centuries of monthly resolved data, and we can use geochemical proxies like the strontium-calcium ratio in order to reconstruct sea surface temperature. So now I'm going to present the results from a modern coral that was collected from Sabine Bank, Vanuatu in the Southwest Pacific, as well as a fossil coral that was collected from Tasmaloon, Vanuatu, about 120 kilometers away from the location of this modern coral. And the fossil coral was uranium-thorium dated to have grown during the medieval climate anomaly about 1,000 years ago. Here I'm showing the results from a modern coral strontium-calcium values converted into sea surface temperature using our local calibration. These are monthly values from 1900 to 2005. And here in the bottom panel, again, I'm showing the monthly sea surface temperature anomalies with respect to the 1961 through 1990 climatology. And we see large amplitude anomalies occurring during these historical El Nino and La Nina events, as shown by the red and the blue triangles. And again, the gray lines behind the time series show the plus or minus 2 sigma range as defined by the percentiles. Here on the top panel is the histogram of the monthly SST values, whose width represents total variability. And the bottom panel is the histogram of the sea surface temperature anomalies. And again, the width of this distribution represents interannual variability. I'm also going to show what the PDFs look like for the same two intervals of less active ENSO in the early part of the 20th century and more active ENSO in the latter part. Here on the left, I'm showing the PDFs for the less active ENSO interval in blue and the more active ENSO interval in red. This distribution represents the total variability within the modern coral reconstructed SSTs. And on the right, I'm showing the distribution of sea surface temperature anomalies, whose width represents interannual variability. We can see that the red curve for the more active ENSO interval is wider than the blue. So this is demonstrating that the coral reconstructed SSTs do capture changes in ENSO over the 20th century. So we wanted to replicate these findings with an additional modern coral to increase the confidence in our ability to use corals to reconstruct interannual variability and using the PDF technique. Here are the replication results. So what we did is we took a previously published modern coral strontium-calcium converted into SST record from Kilbourne et al. And this is a coral from Malo Channel, Vanuatu, located about 120 kilometers to the northeast of Sabine Bank. And these are the PDF comparisons for the SST anomalies from 1940 to 1990. And the Malo Channel coral was treated the exact same way, so we isolated the component due to very interannual timescales when looking at these PDFs. And we selected 1940 through 1990 as the period of overlap because this maximizes the temporal overlap between these two modern coral records. So we see that the modern corals do reproduce, so the general shape and the variability that these two corals are capturing is the same, so this increases our confidence in using the modern corals. Here's a side-by-side comparison for the PDFs for SST anomalies for the Nino 3.4 region on the left and this coral, the Sabine Bank coral strontium-calcium converted into SST on the right. These are sea surface temperature anomalies, so again, this is reflecting interannual variability during the less active and more active ENSO intervals over the 20th century. So we can see that the coral is capturing an increase in width during the more active ENSO interval, shown here by the red curve. So that means we can use this technique. We've demonstrated with both instrumental records from the Niño 3.4 region, as well as coral reconstructed SST from the modern, and we can use this technique to recapture changes in ENSO over the 20th century. So we can also bring this technique to the paleo community and apply it to a fossil coral that grew during the medieval climate anomaly. So in the last portion of this talk, I'm going to present the results from a 104-year-long fossil coral that was uranium-thorium dated to have grown during the medieval climate anomaly. So this is a picture of the reef that the coral was collected from in Tasmaloom, Vanuatu. Here in the top, I'm showing the monthly SST values and the location of the uranium-thorium date that we use to assign calendar years to the coral chronology. And the bottom panel is showing the sea surface temperature anomalies with the gray lines indicating the plus or minus 2 sigma range. Here are the PDFs for the monthly SSTs in the top panel, whose width reflects total variability, and the SST anomalies in the bottom panel, whose width represents interannual variability. And we can see that the plus or minus 2 sigma range of 2.4 degrees C is similar to what we observe in the modern during an interval with less ENSO activity. So to put this into perspective, I'm showing 100 years of medieval climate anomaly fossil coral data with the modern coral. So we can see that the medieval climate anomaly coral SST anomalies is very similar to 20 years of modern coral SST variability during an interval with less ENSO activity. So this suggests that interannual variability during the MCA was of similar magnitude to a period of less ENSO activity that we observe in the 20th century. So to conclude, we demonstrate that we can use the PDS of SST anomalies in order to reconstruct ENSO activity. We demonstrate this both with instrumental records as well as coral records. In terms of ENSO variability at Vanuatu in the Southwest Pacific, we validated our findings with 2 modern corals that are replicated. And then during the MCA, we find that interannual variability during the medieval climate anomaly is of similar magnitude to the modern during an interval where we have less ENSO activity. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you very much. Julian.
Hi, interesting study. You call it the PDF method, but in effect, you're only really using the second moment of the PDF. You're really only looking at the width. But there's a lot more information in the PDF about the peakedness, or the skewness, and the distribution. So you might want to look at higher order moments of the PDF. You might be able to extract more information in your data.
Thank you.
Any other question? Yes?
So why do you think there's less ENSO during the medieval climate? You thought about it?
So we're still investigating why this might be the case. One of the hypotheses is that there are just sort of natural changes in ENSO that occur on different timescales ranging from decades to century-longs. So future work will look into that in greater detail.
Any other questions? If not, go off for lunch, and please come back for the third of the 3 sessions of the Common Era talks. All right. Oh, I think it went well.